And, thanks very much for inviting me. When I received the invitation, I started thinking about the question in relation to my own problems. And one of the problems that I've been having with moral panic theory that I've been struggling with for about 2 or 3 years is that the moral dimension of the panic is very rarely discussed. We call it moral panic, but almost without exception, every contribution on the subject doesn't engage with the issue of morality. And in fact, one of the puzzling things for a social scientist is that when sociology was invented or discussed first by Emile Durkheim, he called it the science de morale. It was a moral kind of project. And yet, even though moral concerns were the ones that incited social theoretical thinking in the 19th century, we tend to think of the word morality as somehow iffy. There's something really wrong with people who use a moral language. And in most discussions, we find that the word morality is almost seen as a kind of false consciousness. And whenever we hear a moral vocabulary, our impulse becomes one of deconstructing it, of saying what is really behind the moral. And both in psychoanalysis and in sociology, moral concepts are usually seen as something that you cannot really take seriously. There's got to be an agenda behind it. It's a kind of false consciousness that you really, sort of got to unravel. And yet, it seems to me that if you look at the way that many of the issues that we're discussing here are unfolding, unless we have an entirely narrow, sort of subjectivist theory, where we assume that people are merely conspiring to create panics and are merely driven by instrumental calculations, unless we assume that's the case, we're left with a kind of moral wasteland. We don't really discuss that. And I think that one of the things I'm really interested in is actually synthesizing the moral with the social, given the fact that most normal human beings in the world do have ideas about right and wrong, do think about good and evil all the time, and when they interpret events, and they react to experience, do it in a vocabulary that is inherently quite a moral one. So it seems to me that attending to the moral is really quite important. And I think it's interesting that when Stanley Cohen did the second edition of his Moral Panic book, he actually noted this in passing, because he made the point that the concept of moral panic evokes some unease, especially about its morality. And he made the point that very often moral panic theoreticians themselves, sort of have a double standard, in the sense that we're very good at criticizing their moral enterprise, their moral crusades, but at the same time, assume that we are above all that we haven't got any kind of moral agendas, that we are free from having a strong sense of right and wrong. And David Garland, sort of has also drawn attention to this. I think he's been quite outstanding in this respect. He made a point that when someone describes an episode as a moral panic, it is always possible to suppose that he or she is simply refusing to take seriously the moral viewpoints of those who are alarmed. There's a kind of very simple, basic assumption there. And what I'll argue in this book that I'm writing at the moment is that moral panic theory is often not free from the moralism it attributes to others. And often theorizing about moral panic conveys unstated negative assumptions about the moral capacity of people who are implicated in the panics. There's a kind of moral judgment that we're making that both obscures our own moral agenda, assumes that we're free from all this, and in the course of doing that, leads to a situation where quite often a lot of contributions, not all of them, but especially in recent times, a fair number of contributions about moral panics are really the writers panicking about how people are going to react to particular kind of events. As a kind of implicit kind of double standard, and it's always been like that. So that's what I'm really concerned with, and having looked at the question of morality, I came to the conclusion that methodologically, in terms of my own orientation, it's best to adopt a historical approach, that in order to understand the vocabulary, the grammar of morality in relation to panics in the 21st century, we've got to understand what is special, unique, and distinct about it. And the way to do it is to look at the past, look at the evolution of moral reactions, moral apprehensions, and try to kind of work out a kind of a theory, a historical theory, the way that emerges. In the course of doing that historical study, I've learned a lot about what a moral panic is as an idea. And contrary to the received wisdom, moral panics were discussed as moral panics a long, long, long time before we think it was. And already in the 19th century, there was a fairly sort of recurring discussion about moral panics, particularly by people who were involved in the domains of theology and religion. They were the first ones, as you would expect. If you know about 19th century philosophical developments, they would be the first ones that would be interested in this. In terms of my own research, the first time that I came across a kind of a reflected discussion on moral panics was in 1830 in the Quarterly Christian Spectator. And they basically talked about moral panics in the context of the moral disorientation of individuals. It was a discussion of how individuals, when they found difficult to gain meaning in everyday experience, sort of were drawn towards moral panic. The next reference to moral panic that I came across was a year later in the Biblical Repertory and Theological Review published in Yale University. And they used the term moral panic in relation to a religious experience that paralyzes the soul. Very Kierkegaardian kind of, and they talk about how it paralyzes the soul and strikes it through with a moral panic. And in these publications, in the 1830s, 1840s, moral panics are used to highlight the uncertainties, the individual uncertainty and upheavals, which serve as a catalyst for panic-like reactions. I suppose the way they were using the term moral panic was almost as an equivalent to moral paralysis, when you have an experience and you kind of react that way. The most interesting discussion I came across in that kind of period was in 1906. In 1906, the Church of England Bishop Mandel Creighton characterized the despair and doubt of biblical figures as a moral panic. And it says, then he realized that the prevailing skepticism was really a moral panic and had to be regarded as such. And he went on to say that there was in fact, a moral and religious panic which swept away many well-intentioned persons by the gathering force of the councils of despair. And what he's really arguing is that actually, moral panics are not rare. That moral panics are quite frequent because, as he puts it, religious difficulties have never ceased to weigh upon the hearts of men. And for him, panics that are moral are inextricably linked to the anxieties and fears provoked by the crisis of belief that haunted Christianity in the early 20th century. So it had a kind of, initially a fairly kind of religious kind of context. The first secular discussion, more secular discussion of moral panic that I came across was in 1895, and that was a discussion in Canada, the Royal Commission on the Liquor Traffic. And in this discussion on the Royal Commission on the liquor traffic, there was a lot of people who today we call moral entrepreneurs of the temperance movement. And one of them talked about how these terrible things that are going on in all the bars. And the judge, who's organizing the commission, says, "So we have a real moral panic here, don't we?" And the guy says yes. And it's a moral panic. And he uses the word. It's a moral panic that is driven by, he calls, moral sentiment. And he says, absolutely. And I think here we have the first, at least the first that I discovered, or I came across, the first reference to the kind of moral panics that would be discussed in a more academic, sociologically informed context in the 60s. Although, as you well know, before Stan Cohen, the most famous, the most significant reference to moral panic is made by Marshall McLuhan in his very famous discussion of the media, where he uses moral panics in the way that I use it, which is, and it's interesting because McLuhan was not a closet Catholic, a real Catholic. He was quite religiously kind of motivated, and his writings are very much a reflection of that. But he talks about moral panics in relation to the new electronic media that comes in, and what he says is that this media has become a very touchy subject because what he's really getting at, people are really scared what's going to happen to the moral order that's being invested in the print, what's going to happen to the moral order that is based upon the alphabet and upon books and everything else. That's really what he's kind of really getting at. And so I think that it's interesting how, when you're looking at the evolution of the moral panic, there's a much more self-conscious, explicit discussion of the domain of the moral, which we begin to lose from the 1960s onward. There's a kind of, from the 1960s onwards, you don't discuss moral issues in good company. It becomes an embarrassment. No serious academic would ever want to be anywhere near anything that is remotely moral. And I think that's a huge problem, because you can discuss morality in an intellectually informed kind of a way. You don't have to be a moralist to discuss kind of basically morality and these kinds of questions. Now, the thing that I'm particularly interested in relation to moral panic theory is the role of the media. And the reason why I'm interested in relation to the role of the media is because the media is often seen in the discussion, both in media theory and also in panic theory, as an instrument of message amplification. The media inflates a particular problem, and it's primarily seen in that kind of narrow, instrumental kind of a way. Whereas actually, if you look at the way that McLuhan talks about the media, but actually the way media works, what's really important about the media is not that it's an instrument of amplification. It does that. It inflates problems all the time. But the very fact that the media, by definition, and all media, call into question the prevailing moral order. I mean, the way to think about the media is that the media is a gateway to opening up a discussion about what is good and what is bad, what is evil, what is wrong. All these questions are immediately raised by it. And in my own work, what I do is I look at the way that the media and the kind of panics that emerge historically are continually attached to moral issues. And if you go back in history, if you go back right to the very beginning of time, you read Plato's Phaedrus, where Socrates basically is told that, is discussing the invention of writing. Socrates says, writing is a bad thing. It's going to create a lot of problems from us. And the guy says, well, Socrates, writing is brilliant. It's doing a lot of good stuff. No. When you write something, unlike in a dialogue, where we know each other, where everything is controlled and confined, the minute you write something down, who knows where it will end up? It might get into the wrong hands. People might draw the wrong conclusions. And you can't really control that. And, we don't realize, but, the way that people reacted to writing, just ordinary writing, was not very different to the way we talk about the internet today, or anything else for that matter. I mean, the Catholic Church was so scared about allowing people to read the Bible, that it actually set up the Inquisition in part because, as many Catholic theologians says, reading opens the door to heresy. Right? I mean, you open the door, and all of a sudden, all these geezers are going to become heretics because, they're now interpreting the Bible in line with their own inclination. And even the Protestant Reformation, which began by saying everybody should have a Bible, it's okay to have the Bible in the vernacular. The minute people started reading the Bible seriously, Luther said this is going too far. We'd rather that people read far less, and began to confine reading in that kind of a way. Imagine what happens when writing and publishing is commercialized. Imagine what happens when Gutenberg invents the printing press, and when you have not just simply the odd scripts here and there, but all of a sudden, you have books being published left and right, people reading novels and newspapers. In the 18th century, what we have for the first time is a non-stop elite-driven sort of panic-like anxiety towards reading. And I think what's interesting, and it's very useful to look at that discussion, is that when they discuss reading, I mean, today our moral panics are about the fact that people don't read enough. Right? A book is going to disappear. We don't really have a reading culture. And then the big problem was that people read too much. They were indiscriminate readers. That was the problem. And the interesting thing about the discussion on reading in the 18th and then in the 19th century is that what they're really worried about, and as is the case with all media, is not actually a specific problem to do with reading. The media effect they were talking about is not a specific consequence. The thing that they were really worried about is what the media of reading does to people. Because what they're really worried about is that the media is going to change people in ways that is unpredictable. What they were really saying was that how can we maintain moral authority? How could we maintain our moral status when we got this unpredictable media occurring? That's in the 18th century. Now, I don't know if any of you ever read any of the discussion on literature, any of the discussion on novels or on the press. But basically what happens in the 18th and 19th century, as part and parcel of this concern about moral authority, is a discussion of the reading public. The reading public becomes precisely, I think earlier on Canetti was up there and the crowds and crowd psychology. The reading public was not seen as a wonderful development in the way you and I might think it's really good. There's a reading public now. The reading public was seen as a potentially very dangerous force, simply because reading was a double-edged sword. It was, yes, it could enlighten people, but it also opens the way for moral corruption. And the theme of moral corruption recurs non-stop from the late 18th century all the way until 1940. It kind of comes up time and time again in all kinds of different ways. The fact that this is going to, the media effect is going to change people, it's going to make people corrupt. I just want to look at some of the consequences of what happens to people when they read. And this is already well in place by the 18th century. This will take different forms in the next 200 years, but it's interesting to kind of reflect upon the way that moral concerns express themselves. By the 18th century, we have the discovery of a very important problem for readers, which is called the reading addiction. I don't know if any of you suffer from that. I mean, I wish that my son would have that problem, or my students would have that kind of disease. But anyways, reading addiction becomes a huge problem. And there are literally hundreds of tracts that deal with the fact that people become so addicted to reading that they lose sort of interest in their work. I mean, the way they talk about reading addiction is almost like if they're talking about dope. So they kind of get strung out and they kind of get weird ideas. They become open to moral corruption. And this discussion just goes, I mean, it is discussed. There's serious, scientific contributions. And today, of course, we've got internet addiction and we've got that kind of equivalent. But I think it's interesting that those kinds of concerns are already in place in the 18th century. The novel in the 18th century was particularly dangerous to women, because women, being what they are easily seduced by the reading of a novel. They got less of a capacity to resist the incitement to seduction. And in fact, Jean-Jacques Rousseau actually said in the 18th century, and you can remember that Rousseau is a progressive. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, "There's never been a chaste woman who read a novel." So I think is a very, very nice expression.
It's not hope for much of us then.
No. Well, you never know. There might be a few of you left. So it leads to seduction of particularly women. Thirdly, and this is very important, because of all the morally corrupting effects of literature, novel leads to crime. And there are all these stories of young 16-year-old boys in London who, because they want to read the next Penny Dreadful, go away and they steal, and they commit crime. There's a kind of kind of criminalization of reading, of popular culture reading, and there's a kind of attempt to, sort of talk about how in the East End of London and elsewhere, people who have become morally corrupted by reading, then go off and do all these negative things. And finally, there's the whole area of moral decline, that as people read more, they just decline as characters, and there's all this pseudo-psychological discussion which looks at people's physical health and their manhood. Men in particular become, if they become too bookish, no longer have those masculine, manly qualities. So that by the end of the, by 1900, 1905, the media effect is there, sort of truly in place. Now the reason why I make this point isn't to say that everything is the same, because obviously our historical experience is very different, and there is specific mutations in the way that people experience fear, and the way that's mediated by the media. The point I'm really making is that by the 18th, 19th century, the cultural resources on which moral panic is drawn are already there. I mean, I cannot think of a single variation of moral panic today that wasn't already in place by the 18th, 19th century. The big difference is that in the 18th, 19th century, these discussions were conducted in an explicitly moral language. And because they were discussed in an explicitly moral language, our capacity to engage with it at that level would have been much, much easier. Now what happens, later on is obviously, as you know, we no longer find it comfortable to talk in moral idioms. We medicalize everything, right? Everything becomes, totally medicalized, because that becomes a much, much easier kind of way of doing it. I want to kind of end by making one point, which is, it's a point that I feel particularly strongly about, and when I make these points in seminars, sometimes I get a bit of a reaction to it, which is that actually, when you're looking at these kind of panics in relation to the media, and there's been fairly recurrent ones, these are panics that are elite inspired, and they often have to do with the cultural elites of different societies trying to maintain distinctions in a Borderian sense, where they kind of use symbolic issues as a site for struggle as to who's going to have aesthetic aesthetic and normative authority. And people don't realize that aesthetic and normative struggles can be very violent. We tend to think that they're just about ideas, but they are really hugely violent, because they embrace our persona in a very kind of direct kind of a sense. And I think that we as academics are often not aware of that. I think a lot of our academics themselves become implicated in this discussion. And I find today, for example, when I hear colleagues, particularly in journalism and communication studies, talk about the tabloid press, talk about the internet, and we have expressions like tabloid readers. Who are the tabloid readers? Well, they're all these overweight, beer-drinking, horrible people who do horrible things to one another. And there's a kind of moral devaluation that is often implicit in some of the discussions that we have about moral panic. It's always people like them that panic, that kind of react that kind of way, whereas you and I are ever so clever and intelligent, we're kind of above that. But actually, what I'm really trying to say is that just as those panics in the 18th, 19th century were elite motivated, and was an attempt on their part to maintain a certain distinction of moral and cultural authority, so too academics today are very often on a slightly milder level complicit in a very similar kind of project. And I would just say, have a think about that and look at the implications of that, because it seems to me that we're moving into a time when, precisely because moral authority is continually contested, because there really isn't even an agreement on what moral authority is in the way that was at least in the 18th, 19th century, it's pretty much the case. It's almost inevitable that these kinds of panic-like reactions are going to proliferate and intensify and acquire the most surprising forms. I mean, who would have thought that, as somebody said before, in public baths in Glasgow, You know, I mean, who dreamt that one up? You know, I mean, we are moving to a world where those kinds of sort of unexpected reactions are going to become much more deeply entrenched, and it's going to be important for us to take both a moral and historical distance from that if you're going to have a certain intellectual grasp of those kinds of events. Thank you.